continued on and progressed and made it even better. And so Dale's going to be talking about, with us about ranching in sync with nature. And of course, Dale has a grass-fed operation, Lasater Grasslands Beef. So, Dale, carry on.
Is it possible to keep the lights a little higher on them?
Kim, let's go ahead and just knock the lights except for this bank here. Keep this bank on. He'd like a little more light than what we had in the last one. Is that? It's either all or none, huh? What about the fade in out on these other lights? Is that? Do we have any of that? No? Is that? Okay. Go ahead and, the other way. Okay. Here's Dale. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be here today. Great to hear Meg. Hard act to follow. That was tremendous. I should have just ceded you my time and you could tell us a few more stories and keep us going. After 40-some years of marriage, I should have learned fully by now, but I'm a slow learner and somewhat hard-headed. But I tend to be a little impulsive and sometimes make decisions that I shouldn't have made. But I think my wife is in the back, and so I can consult with her shortly. But I think our first decision after this meeting will be to head to Windsor, Colorado, and buy some of the products we don't produce ourselves. And I think we're close. I hope we're within the 100-mile cutoff line. And if we're not, we'll move our north fence and try to get a little closer. Well, this is the home place, our headquarters with Pikes Peak in the background. And it doesn't loom quite this large in real life, but we do enjoy seeing the snow-capped Front Range, 50 miles to the west of us. We're about 80 miles southeast of this hotel. So it was nice to have the group out on Sunday. Harvey and Dan brought one busload of this group meeting here, and it looked about like this, a little snow. There was some snow falling. It was nice to have a couple of men from Mongolia. I didn't get a chance to visit very much with them, but they were among the group, along with a couple from Belgium, people from all over this country, and including a man from Las Cruces, New Mexico. We leased a ranch some years ago near Las Cruces, and this is pretty much desert country, semi-desert, semi-arid, but Las Cruces really is the desert, and it was rated at 4 cows to the section. Anyway, I like that country and enjoyed learning something about running cattle there for a few years. There were 2 men in the area down there who had been friends from childhood, and they'd spent their whole lives as neighbors, and Fred and Jim. And when they got up in years, they made a pact, and they decided that whichever was the first one to go, they would attempt to make contact. And so sure enough, Fred went first, and after his passing, Jim tried on a number of occasions to kind of concentrate and make contact, but nothing happened. There wasn't any response. But one day he was out in the pasture and unexpectedly heard something, and he thought, well, maybe. He said, Fred, is that you? He said, yes, it's me. Well, Fred, how is it? What's it like? And Fred said, well, it's actually quite fantastic. I get up every morning and have a big breakfast and great variety of wonderful things to eat. And he said, after breakfast, I spend the rest of the morning in the company of some very attractive young ladies, very, very animated, very lively. At midday, again, lunchtime, we have a great variety of good things to eat. After lunch, I take a nap, and then in the afternoon, I'm again in the company of these attractive young ladies. And when he stopped, there was kind of an extended silence, and Jim said, well, Fred, I'm a little surprised. That's not what I expected heaven to be like. And Fred said, who said anything about heaven? I'm a bull on a ranch in Colorado. So, this was the scene that the group saw on Sunday. I told them if any of them came to this session today, they'd see green grass instead of the landscape that they saw on Sunday. There are times when those of us raising livestock in the short grass prairie think we are something akin to what we might imagine heaven to be like. And then there are a lot of other times when things look we might have been relegated to a very different place. And I can think of the drought of 2002, the blizzard of October 1997, which some of my compatriots here in the room would remember. We've been on this property since the late 1940s when my parents arrived here from South Texas. And we've had 4 killer blizzards in that period of time. So happily they don't occur more than about every 15 years. That's enough to kind of recover and recoup. In fact, yesterday and today we're supposed to have nice sunshine, but it would be very different if we were undergoing what they have in the East Coast right now, with 1 2-foot storm and another one right behind it. So leaving aside the good people of Maryland and Virginia and Pennsylvania and other states, I guess we can say, since it's happening in Washington, D.C., couldn't happen to a nicer group of people. But March is coming up, so I won't say that too smugly, because we could well have our turn before the season is out. Anyway, it was nice to welcome the group on Sunday, and the place did look a little bit different, but we, at least 6 months of the year, usually have something green and growing, and actually have something growing probably close to 9 months of the year with our combination of cool season grasses. Andy Duffy, my friend and ranch manager, put these slides together, and I appreciate him putting in this picture of bulls. 4 years ago, I had a close encounter of the bull kind on a ranch we lease in Texas, Central Texas. We were working cattle, and I was not aware of all the details, but I ended up, I was looking at, the work was pretty much over, and I was looking at a clipboard, and next thing I knew, or didn't know, I was lying on the dirt in this corral, and blood was coming out of my head, and I was unconscious. The cowboys that I was working with, not a nice group of guys, but they only had one real goal, and that was to get me off the ranch before I expired. So I woke up in the back of a pickup, we were about 20 miles out of the town of Albany, Texas. And there was quite a bit of blood around. Anyway, they got me into Albany and got the blood stopped, and the doctor there put 12 stitches up through the top of my head. Anyway, there were a couple of nurses kind of asking me questions to figure out the state of my mind, and they said, well, what day of the week is it? And I had driven until late at night and got up early in the morning. Anyway, I said Tuesday, but it turned out it was Wednesday, and that set off a few red flags. Then she asked me where I was born, and I said, well, I was born on the short grass prairie just west of Last Chance. And when she heard that, she knew I was probably in worse shape than I appeared. So they loaded me up again, happily this time not in a pickup truck, and hauled me to the next town, Breckenridge, which had more facilities, more machinery, so they could run a bunch of tests. Anyway, by about midnight, my wife, fortunately, was there, and she did not want me to spend the night in the hospital, and by midnight they decided they couldn't figure anything out, so they let us go home to my aunt and uncle's home. But the doctor said, well, I would like to see you in the morning just to make sure everything's all right. So we went in the next morning, and he looked me over and said, well, it seems to be all right, but with this type of head injury, you should be aware that sometimes there's a delayed reaction and things may happen after you get back home. He said you may have some mood changes. You may have some lapse of memory. You may have some sudden outbursts of anger. And my wife, sitting alongside me, spoke up and said, well, doctor, that explains the future. How do you explain the past? So, no sudden decisions, Meg, but I'll hope to see you soon. That's what spouses are for, right? So again, this is August. We've been calving since 1960 in August. Dad was a stranger to the short grass prairie when my parents got here in 1948. But he realized after 10 years of trying to make it work that calving in February and March was not what nature intended. So he switched to this routine, and it's worked very well. We breed for 45 days, and calf average birthday is probably the first week in August. So this is the kind of summer that we like to have. It doesn't happen every year, but we don't have standing water on the short grass prairie every year. But it is nice. You can get a feel for the condition of the cows. Meg gave us some of the details, and it's nice to have all of the scientific and other details. So as we talk about ranching in sync with nature, there are three parts to it. The land and the forage, which is our starting place, the cattle, and the wildlife. And I will touch briefly on those three things. We got involved with Alan Savory back in the early 1980s, shortly after he arrived in this country from Zimbabwe. And I think his work and his book, Holistic Resource Management, is certainly one of the essential pieces of reading material for anyone involved with range management, or any kind of management for that matter, but specifically range management. We had a pretty set method of moving cattle around on this property for the first 35 years we were on it. We had summer pastures and winter pastures. We run along the big sandy creek for about 10 miles, and so all of our winter pastures bordered the creek, and our summer pastures were out in the open. So a couple of things happened as we got involved with cross fencing and moving the cattle. This is, as you can see, mainly it's a fairly small traditional pasture, and mainly cheatgrass. This picture was taken some 20 years ago. Just so happened that we were never in this pasture at the time that cheatgrass was palatable, and it prospered and spread and sort of dominated. And when we came into this pasture, anyway, as we changed, we began coming into this pasture early when they would eat the cheatgrass with a whole herd of cattle, and over time, of course, that simply brought on a lot of changes, a lot of diversity. That's a county road just beyond the cows, and beyond that county road is the east end of our ranch, and it's all open country. And again, that was summer pasture. We went in with the cows on about June 1st and came out around October 1st. Well, it just so happens that that's in that sandier rolling hill country to the east of that county road. There's a tremendous amount of needle and threadgrass. And I know that's may not be considered one of the most desirable grasses, but we've got a lot of it, and it produces, and of course at a certain time in the grazing season, every plant is palatable and nutritious. But we were never there at that time with needle and threadgrass, so it simply spread and was there and was never used. By the time the cattle moved in, there were plenty of warm season grasses available. And so we changed our patterns of movement, and we began going out there in March. I would have told you that there was nothing growing in March, but the first time Harvey and Dan came out there 20 plus years ago, we drove out into this area, which I never had occasion to be in the wintertime because we didn't have any cattle out there. And sure enough, there was needle and threadgrass 3 or 4 inches tall, first week in March. So we began using that, and I think so. Two things happened as we changed our focus. One was using things like cheatgrass and needle and threadgrass that were already there that we simply hadn't used, and the second was, two of the points that Alan Savory brought into focus for us were herd impact and long rest periods, redefining overgrazing as being continuous grazing. Anyway, we began putting in electric fences. We use all one-wire electric fences and centers. This was a traditional windmill. This was the first one we put in. This pasture has four square sections. This windmill happened to be in the center, going back many years, the center of the 4 sections. And so this particular cell has 11 paddocks coming to one point. And of course, a couple of things became obvious fairly soon. One is most of us ranchers thought when you concentrated cattle, you'd have, bare areas or areas that were beaten out. And of course, that was true with a traditional windmill. If you put on 3 or 4 times that amount of cattle, but in this case, of course, everything's sectioned off, so here you have on the left the paddock that these cattle were currently in, and on the right a resting paddock. Same thing here. These cells we put in, you can see the corridor is very narrow. It's only about 12 or 15 feet from the trough. And interesting thing is, so that's the only area that's beaten out as opposed to a traditional watering place where if you climb up on a windmill and look out, you can see this area of weeds and bare ground that's been beaten out because the cattle all came in and then all went out every day, and there was no resting for that particular area. The interesting thing here is not only is the grass, good native grasses.
Use your pointer here if you want.
Thank you. Good native grasses growing not just up to the edge of this enclosed area, but actually, western wheatgrass and other grasses growing into this corridor. So, pretty amazing that what we found actually was that the impact was beneficial, and the best grass and the best diversity of grasses was actually closer to the center. So in all of our subsequent centers, we don't have one center. We have a series of centers that maybe this is maybe a quarter of a mile out into the paddock. So we have several different centers for each cell, so they all connect, but maybe as the group saw on Sunday, maybe 3 or 4. Am I hitting something?
No, it's not that actually.
I mean, it doesn't bother me, but I just didn't know what I was hitting.
I think you're fine.
So they connect maybe 4 or 5 paddocks in one to each watering or center, and then they can move. They all connect to the other. Typically, they're moving between maybe 10 and 10 and 15 paddocks in each center. These are yearling bulls and steers in this particular. Another group of first calf heifers that are about to move and moving into a new paddock. The moving, of course, just involves opening the gate. They get at first we had whistles and we'd call, but all you got to do now is just drive in and they're ready for the new pastures. So that process is pretty easy. Again, it's a lot of people think, well, this is going to be pretty labor intensive. That's yellow clover. They're in there. Every 4 or 5 years we have a clover year. Other years we have sunflowers. This is a couple of pictures here. You can see looking east toward this gate there, and close, looking more down. And this is that first picture was in the discounting the green. That first picture was in because it was taken earlier in the season. That first picture was in the late 80s, and this in the late 90s. Again, looking from roughly the same place, looking north toward, this is the big sandy creek with the cottonwood trees, looking north, and then 10 years later. My perspective goes back further. In a family of cattle people, we were 6, my siblings were 6 siblings. Every family has someone who's considered a little weird, and I had a couple of traits that were different from my siblings. One is I liked chickens, and so raising chickens on a cattle ranch was not exactly. So they tolerated it more or less. Secondly, I like to hunt arrowheads, and so my perspective of the short grass prairie is spending many years out wandering over the hills, a lot of hours hunting arrowheads, and that was 50 years ago, and so I got a pretty good look at a lot of prairie and a lot of hills from just walking along, looking down. That doesn't bother me, but I don't. I guess I'm not doing anything. It's just. I wonder if it doesn't make any difference. I just didn't know if it was something obvious. Anyway, in my arrowhead hunting years, there would be a clump of grass, and it was bare all around, and another clump, blue grama grass probably, and so that was arrowhead hunting. And these tall grasses, they weren't there. So it's called the short grass prairie, but of course the short grass prairie doesn't mean buffalo grass and blue grama grass. It means short grass compared to the tall grass and mid grass and so on, just a function of moisture. But actually we have these things like switchgrass, prairie sand reed, a lot of sand blue stem on the east end of the ranch in a sandier soil. All of those hit a person like me at close to waist high. So it's not exactly short grass as I thought of it in my arrowhead hunting years. There's a lot more there, and the long rest periods simply have allowed some of these remnants, among them green needle grass, winterfat, and so on, to come back and prosper. We had a number of, the green needle grass likes this same clay soil. It's called Dobie locally. It likes that just like western wheatgrass. So a lot of these large areas where we have western wheatgrass. Well, moving on to the cattle, these are yearling heifers just at weaning time. We keep them pinned up for a couple of days and have people fooling around with them to just get them used to being around people. They're turned out in the pasture just after weaning. This is my dad, Tom Lasater. Dad was the one that kind of simplified and codified, so to speak. He called it the 6 Essentials, our cattle selection program. And also, although our family ranching operation goes back 2 generations, when his father and grandfather began in the beef cattle business in the 1880s. But Dad was the one that really turned us toward thinking of nature as our partner, not as our adversary. And today's topic, was, branching in sync with nature. First calf heifers, they're put with their bull mates. It's been a closed herd since 1937. No outside blood brought in. These are put with their mates 45 days at 14 months old, so they're 14 to 15 months. They're calving right on their second birthday. And all of our selection of both heifers and bulls is done on grass. So the heifers are grown out on grass. They're calving in grass pastures, obviously, and this is the same first calf heifers about 7 months later in April. So this is, I call the bottom of our forage cycle April 15th, and so we're about 60 days away from it now. And then we start into the new. So this is the old grass that they're on through the winter. And most winters they can graze pretty much through the winter, maybe with the exception of a couple of blizzards that may last a week or so. We do have the occasional year when we get early snows that stay on, but they're on grass and growing out on grass. These are bulls and steers approaching 2 years of age. This is most of the cattle going into our grass-fed beef program are either side of 24 months old, depending on the seasons. These bulls be weighing, that we sell for breeding stock, will be weighing 1,100 pounds at this time, raised fully on grass. Their steer mates will probably run 1050 or 1150 at 2 years old, and heifers the same thing, 1,000 to 1,100 pounds. The ones that didn't breed and go into the grass program. So all of our selection is based on grass. Everything we look at, weaning weights, yearling weights, everything based on grass. Dad decided years ago, we have this thing in this country we call bulls performance tested, and they're fed. We call this performance testing, but Dad's view was cattle should be tested and studied and selected in the environment they're used. Well, you can see these bulls and steers in the summertime, they're slick. People come to the ranch now and in fly season and say, well, what's your fly program? And because they don't see many flies. I'm sure the rotation probably helps somewhat too in breaking the cycle. But I think we have, our vet has been Bangs vaccinating our calves, our heifer calves, and about this time every year in February. And the heifers were coming, so he's been, front end of the heifer coming through the chute, he's been seeing that for 40 years. And several years ago, he suddenly said, these heifers don't have any lice. He just realized he was seeing this thing that he'd always been seeing. Cow size, the cattle you see if you come to the ranch, this is a result, not a, again, this is April when we see the lice. We do have cattle still that show lice, but much less than when we were treating them 40 years ago. So this, again, is what we call natural selection, just putting the pressure on the cattle and letting them figure it out. Cow size, the same thing. This is a 16-year-old cow with her 15th calf. Again, we keep almost all of our yearling heifers, just anything with obvious defects. We'll take out. Otherwise, we put them into the system and let the program be weeding them out. Sure. So we can't predict which heifers will breed at 14 months. If you look at the ones that are open when we preg test, or which ones are bred, they're an exact cross-section of the herd from the biggest and prettiest to the smaller and less impressive ones. So all of these things have a combination of traits that we're not capable of figuring out, so we simply, again, call it natural selection. So there are times when the grass is green, and as we shift to wildlife, and I'll speed up here a little bit, there's a lot of wildlife out on the prairie. A lot of wildlife out on the prairie, and starting with the pronghorn antelope, second fastest mammal in the world. They're tremendous animals. I'm sure we can appreciate these larger animals. They seem to do all right when we're hauling hay out to the cattle. The pronghorn somehow make it. I'm sure there are times when they're in all of nature. There are certain times when there's a die-off. We appreciate the mule deer and to a lesser extent the white-tailed deer that have come in recent years. We haven't had hunting on this ranch for 60 years of any kind, but we are now starting some hunting with the idea of trimming the whitetail a little bit and trying to protect the native mule deer population. A nice little group of mule deer, again, along the big sandy creek, the cottonwood trees in the background. So we can appreciate the large animals. We probably appreciate the horned owls and hawks, wild turkeys. I can probably name you 3 or 4 different birds, having spent my life there. But it was an eye-opener for me when my sister brought out a group of birders. I didn't even know there was such a term. But they started at the headquarters and walked a mile north across the Big Sandy Creek onto the hills on the north side, and they counted in 3 or 4 hours 80 different birds. So, and they're not allowed to list them unless they actually see them. They would hear them and say that's something, names I'd never heard of, but only if they then saw it could they list it. Anyway, this was an eye opener for me. Swift foxes. This is on the ranch. We don't often see them since they're nocturnal, but they did a count a few years ago, and Andy was able to get this shot as they let this swift fox out of the trap. Porcupines, kind of exotic, jackrabbits. But what about some of the smaller animals, inhabitants of the shortgrass prairie? This is the only slide in this collection I'm showing you today. It's not on the ranch, showing these red ants. And the reason I'm showing it is this overgrazed, depleted piece of prairie near the ranch that we see quite a collection of red ant hills on. And this was a familiar sight to me when I was a kid, because as Dad bought adjoining properties, a lot of them had small areas of cultivation, 80 or 100 acres that had been fields, and instead of reseeding them, he did nothing, just fenced them into larger grass pastures. And a couple of things happened, and this was the first thing. This horde of red ants would move into these old fields and just cover it, even more tightly spaced than this. The cattle would also come in as weeds grew. Again, we call them weeds, but they're palatable and useful. And they would come in. So now it would be very hard to find these places. I know where some of them are, these old fields, but if someone just came onto the place, they would have trouble spotting them. Again, all these burrowing animals, do we appreciate what they're doing? The pocket gophers, all of these red ant hills and pocket gophers, as they move, this will all come up in cool season grasses, western wheat, and other grasses. In a largely blue ground on a buffalo grass pasture, every one of those pocket gopher holes will come up in cool season grasses. These things are working night and day, and they're out there. We don't have to have any inputs or anything else. How about the most maligned and vilified inhabitant of the shortgrass prairie, the prairie dogs? Do we appreciate them? I was sent from the Department of Ag a questionnaire a few years ago, a survey, and they wanted to know how many acres we had covered by pocket gophers and prairie dogs and other pests. And I sent back the survey and said, and also sent a letter saying that I would suggest that we come up with some other word other than pest to describe these burrowing animals. But apparently they didn't have anyone around the office low enough on the totem pole, so no one responded to my letter. And this just came in the mail a couple of weeks ago, and I see we still have this terminology. This research bulletin anyway, the list of people involved and agencies was in this thing was quite impressive. And the only thing that I couldn't find in the footnotes was what herbicide they had used to eliminate all forage, grasses, forbs, and weeds from the area of these prairie dogs. But anyway, we see things differently. And so after several unsuccessful attempts, in earlier years we teamed up with the professionals, Chris and Kelly Rowe, and spent time and money to reintroduce a group of prairie dogs. So this picture was taken in April, with the pronghorn antelope, coyote in the background, just the beginnings of new grass season, some cool season grasses coming out that the pronghorn is appreciating. Anyway, we didn't use herbicides in the vicinity of these prairie dogs, so there is some growth, and we think that has a lot to do with more to do with continuous grazing than it does to prairie dogs. In the beginning, the first slide, we saw Pike's Peak, which brings back memories of Zebulon Pike coming out in the early part of the 19th century. His description of coming through the Great Plains, of course, we got this misnomer of the Great American Desert, but again, it was all compared to the trees, forests of Appalachia, the tall grass prairie, the mid-grass prairie. By the time they got out here, it did look pretty desolate, but tremendous. So what our forebears, the European settlers, found in the last half of the 19th century was an incredible ecosystem, everything operating in complete harmony, all the animals that we just saw, along with elk and bison, living here by the millions, and this thing that was, we're talking today about sustainable ranch land. Well, this is part of it, and I realize that it's not accepted wisdom, but we're very excited about having this keystone species back in our midst after 50 years. Our website is under this name, and we'd love to have you come out and see for yourself. Thank you very much.